Hello and welcome to the live coverage of the 2022 End Persecution of Falun Gong Parade in the nation's capital. I'm David Zhang, and I'm so glad to have you all joining us today for this coverage. Yesterday marked the 23rd year of the persecution of Falun Gong, or Falun Dafa, which is a spiritual meditation exercise. Today, Falun Gong practitioners gather near Capitol Hill to raise awareness of the ongoing persecution still in China. Now, we'll be taking you through the parade event today, but first, let me introduce you to our distinguished panel with our three guests today. First, let me welcome Levi Browdy, Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, as well as joining us in studio is Tiffany Meyer, host of NTD's China in Focus. And we have the privilege to welcome Dr. Anders Kaur, who is joining us online as our special China expert. He also is the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk, as well as the principal of Core Analytics. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. And Levi, let's kind of turn to you first, right? What exactly is Falun Gong and why is it being persecuted in China?
Sure. So Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that involves slow-moving exercises, a sitting meditation, but also the studying of the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. It was first made public in China in 1992 and immediately became very, very popular, primarily because of health benefits. So people always started to tell their friends and family because they were getting very, very healthy, chronic illnesses were going away. But pretty soon, actually, people, as they delved more into the teachings of Falun Gong, they realized, actually, this is a fairly profound spiritual practice that really takes back or draws from the traditional culture of China.
Okay, and we have the very good honor to listen to some of the beautiful on-the-ground music from the Tango Marching Band. So let's just bring in our live coverage here on the ground near the National Mall and listen to the Tango Marching Band perform their music. Route today, and let me just put up the map as to where they're heading. Here down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the destination for today's parade will be near the Freedom Plaza, which will be very much near the Washington Monument as well as the White House. And so that's where we're going to continue our coverage, but kind of resume our discussion earlier. Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual exercise, right? It's being persecuted in China. Why?
So by the end of it was first to understand in throughout the 1990s, it was extremely popular. In fact, the Chinese government did a survey and found at the end of about 1998, 170 to 100 million people were practicing. Okay. So with that many people practicing, some in the Chinese Communist Party leadership grew nervous. There's also the spiritual component. For decades, the Chinese government has tried to instill Marxism and Leninism on the Chinese people, and along comes something that's really heartland traditional Chinese, bringing back some of the great things of traditional Chinese culture. That played a role, but the main reason that the persecution started was the leader of the CCP at the time, a man named Jiang Zemin, was really looking to build up his own power base. He came to power in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre, didn't have a lot of credibility around the other people in the leadership, and he saw in Falun Gong what he thought was an easy target to kind of have a cultural revolution to build up his own power base. And he chose Falun Gong, and that's tragically really the main reason the persecution started, is Jiang Zemin wanted to have a group to sort of paint as evil and mobilize the whole society to build his own cult of personality up. That's really what happened.
Right. So, and we'll definitely go over what exactly is that cult of personality with our two other experts that are covering China. But first, the idea is that why should the American people care so much about something that's from China?
I think it comes down to three things. First, the persecution of Falun Gong is really the canary in the coal mine for 21st century tyranny. It came at a time when the internet was rising, when China was rising, and the methods that the CCP used to persecute Falun Gong, we now see being dealt on other groups, other regions, and even impacting us in the West. So this is really important. It's like an incubator for persecution that we're all starting to feel from the CCP. That's the first reason. The second reason is the Falun Gong, out of the Falun Gong community, both inside China and outside China, became voices and activism and organizations that really became the largest whistleblower of the CCP's crimes on the world stage. And so that's been very helpful for the world community because it's helped us understand the nature of the threat. I think the third reason is something that speaks to our humanity, and that is we're talking about people who believe in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, and they're being persecuted for that. And if we as a world community can't stand up and say something about that, something's really, really wrong. So I think those are the main three reasons, I'd say.
Now, of course, if you're just joining us right now, this is the live coverage of the parade to call for the end of persecution of Falun Gong in China. And as we can see here, leading the way is a large banner that says Falun Dafa is great. Now, throughout the parade today, you're going to see all kinds of different banners. Some of them will be in English and some of them will be in Mandarin Chinese, so I'll break that down for you as well. Tiffany, let me turn to you now with kind of the question maybe many people would have, which is, what was the relationship between Falun Gong and the Chinese government?
Also, to begin, kind of, Levi covered that a little bit, right? When it first started in, say, 1992, it was very popular. And actually, at the time, there was kind of this Qigong craze happening in China. So there's a lot of excitement and involvement in this. So even the Chinese regime and state media was promoting this because, as Levi mentioned, there's a lot of health benefits to it. And then, as he also mentioned, right, it became really popular. So a lot of Chinese Communist Party officials were also practicing this, right? A lot of people wanted to become healthier, but they also really liked the moral component to it. But with the Chinese regime, right, they're atheist to begin with, and so they can't stand anything that threatens their thing. They can't have anything that's a higher authority than them. And so based on the Marxist-Leninism, there's a lot of struggle involved. And so Jiang Zemin, as Levi mentioned, wanted to build his own power base. And so he saw this massive amount of people that had more numbers than were in the Chinese Communist Party, and he saw that as a threat to his power and his party. And so basically overnight, on 7/20 in 1999, they just started this overnight campaign where all the state media, every state organ, everything like schools, companies, just cracked down. We're like, you can't do this. And so no one had ever seen that. It's like if you're just doing yoga, right, for your own benefit, and then suddenly it's illegal.
So that's interesting because China is the only place or a country that you cannot practice Falun Gong legally, right? Seems like everywhere else in the world you can. Why is that?
Well, so it kind of goes back to the Chinese regime's build and stuff. So anything the Chinese regime can't control, they're like, either we have to change it so that they agree with us, or we have to destroy it. So that's what you see with Falun Gong especially, because you can't control hearts, right? You can't control what people believe. They try. I mean, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, they realized, oh, they could kind of silence students quite easily. But they realized with Falun Gong, they thought it'd be like a 3-day thing. They could just wipe them all out, silence them, but that didn't quite play out.
I see. Okay. Dr. Cord, let me just get this kind of sorted out here. Today is the 20th, or yesterday actually, marked the 23rd year the persecution has been ongoing. Why do you think the persecution hasn't stopped yet? Sorry, I don't think we can hear your sound right now. Let me just quickly, Levi, perhaps we can jump to you and get you to answer this question for now.
I think there's a few reasons. First of all, when they first started the persecution, this came from the top, and so there's no impetus or any sort of appetite for stopping it. As the persecution progressed and the level of atrocities, the horrors that were unfolding, they realized this became a cover-up. Now they couldn't, they crossed a line where they couldn't go back, they couldn't say, oh, sorry, we were wrong, because so many top-level officials were implicated in such horrible crimes. And I think the last part about why it hasn't stopped is now, as I mentioned, Falun Gong is a leading whistleblower on the world stage, and were they to change their attitude about Falun Gong, Falun Gong would have probably even a bigger voice and calling them out on the crimes that they've committed.
I see. And Dr. Kaur, let me know if you can hear or answer this question here, which is the Chinese regime, it seems with Falun Gong as well as many other religious groups in China, are they waging a war on religion in China?
I do think so. The Chinese regime is not only taking it out against Falun Gong, which I believe is a genocide. The repression, I believe, is a genocide against Falun Gong. But of course, they're using the similar tactics against Uyghurs. And arguably, the tactics against the Uyghurs came after the Falun Gong, the genocide against the Falun Gong. So they're just moving that genocide, rolling it over to a new religion. And they're using similar tactics against Christians, Taoists. They're knocking down crosses from the churches, Christian churches. Tibetan Buddhists are under attack. So the Chinese Communist Party really is it's a Marxist party, a Marxist-Leninist party. It's against religion. Marx has always thought that religion was the opiate of the masses, and it's always been the Marxists and the communists have always attacked religion.
Thank you. And let's just quickly introduce our next topic with a short video here. And this is for a concept we're going to be discussing, which is called the 610 office, and how exactly that plays into the persecution and what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll have that for you now.
On June 10th, 1999, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party created a group for handling the Falun Gong problem. That group created what came to be known as the 610 office, named for the date of its establishment. Since then, the 610 office has overseen China's nationwide persecution of Falun Gong. The 610 office exists above Chinese law. Despite having no legal mandate, it's been given enormous financial resources. Reuters has compared the 610 office to the Nazi Gestapo, or secret police. The 610 office has deep ties to the Chinese police, labor camps, state-run media, the court system, schools and universities, and even Chinese embassies around the world, directing them to carry out the Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong. For nearly 23 years, the 610 office has been responsible for the mass surveillance, arrest, detention, and torture of millions of Falun Gong practitioners in China. The United States Congress and other members of the international community have repeatedly demanded that the Chinese government put an end to the 610 office.
And thank you for coming back and joining us for the live coverage of the 2022 End Persecution of Falun Gong Parade in Washington, D.C. Levi, I turn to you now for the video we just watched, which is about the 610 office, right? I've heard terms described as the Chinese version of the Gestapo or the secret police, the SS. Define for us, why is a special task force needed for the particular case of Falun Gong, persecution of Falun Gong?
Well, I think it goes back to what was happening in the 1990s. You know, Falun Gong was a household name, widely popular. So how do you take a group like that and target them when a lot of the security apparatus, the police officers, the police chiefs, some of the intelligence officers themselves are practicing Falun Gong. Their families are practicing Falun Gong. So how do you solve that problem? What Jiang Zemin realized is he needed to create a completely separate apparatus that reported directly to him outside of the constraints of the Chinese government. It's really an extra-legal organization so that he could get people that would actually go out and do this. Because again, he's dealing with a populace that at that time understood Falun Gong fairly well and respected it quite a bit.
And Tiffany, is the 610 office still in operation today?
So officially no, but unofficially yes. So basically what happened is it was started on June 10th, 1999, so 610, to deal with this so-called Falun Gong problem, right? But then in 2018, it was officially disbanded. But there's a high-level official that was quoted by Minghui.org, which basically follows Falun Gong people inside China. And so this was overheard, and basically he was saying to other officials that the Falun Gong problem still exists, so the needs of the 610 office are still there. So basically it was merged with something called the Political and Legal Affairs Committee. But the head of that is also the head of the person dealing with the Falun Gong problem. And so basically it has the same function as the 610 office, but without that name. And so as Levi mentioned, it's above the law because they basically know what they're doing is so atrocious, it wouldn't even stand by Politburo law. So they had to create something that wouldn't be held accountable, where they could do all these tortures and like inhumane things.
Right, and the idea of using extra legal groups or organizations isn't something new. And in fact, it seems from my coverage, and Tiffany, I believe you as well, the idea of using some sort of a secret organization to do the dirty work so that the CCP itself can seem like it's not involved in it. Seems like Hong Kong was a prime example of this. So Levi, what were some of the aftermath, if we can call it lessons, but some of the things that they learned through the 610 system that they've utilized now in China to suppress other groups?
Well, it spans the gamut, really. I mean, all the way from, let's start with some of the more base, sort of horrific stuff. In some of the labor camps, one of their goals was the reason they torture and inflict so much pain on Falun Gong practitioners, they wanted to transform them, right? Get them to abandon their faith and pledge sort of this allegiance to the Communist Party. Well, how do you do that? Torture is not as simple as it is on TV.
Right.
And they actually refined these methods against Falun Gong, in particularly in a labor camp called Masanja. And once they got proficient at it, they would actually have people tour the country and train other labor camps to do that. So that's one example of something that came out of the 610, and of course, as I mentioned, this is now not just a Falun Gong, they're now employing these techniques on Uyghurs and others. I think another thing that came out of 610 is the surveillance aspect. And again, over the last 20 years, technology has changed a lot. 610 and their monitoring and surveilling of Falun Gong has greatly evolved along technological lines, creating databases, tracking movement, and both online and in the real world. And that's another outcome of what 610 has done to Falun Gong.
And let's just take a look on the ground there. We're seeing a large banner in Chinese that says, the world needs truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, or in Chinese as Zhen Shanren. And that's really the core principle teachings of Falun Gong, if I have that correctly. Today, there's a very interesting concept the FBI has been calling the term transnational repression, right? And what that basically is the fact that another country is able to insert itself into, say, the United States and commit crimes and to suppress its dissidents who happen to have the luck to escape China after the persecution. So, Dr. Kaur, let's kind of talk about this concept, right? This year in January, the director of FBI, Christopher Wray, he outlined this, and China has been a primary sort of actor that does the transnational repression. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the transnational repression is when the Chinese Communist Party would reach out globally and repress activists or lawyers, human rights lawyers, Falun Gong, anyone who the Chinese Communist Party really sees as a threat. And it's often people who used to be Chinese nationals and then they switched their citizenship to a new country, but perhaps the Chinese regime does not recognize that. And they would have their agents in those countries, whether that's Australia, Thailand, the United States, often use physical force against people that the Chinese Communist Party sees as a threat.
How does this apply, Levi, to Falun Gong specifically as it goes here in the United States?
It's evolved.
Okay.
When the persecution first started back in 1999, it was very basic and thuggery-like. We had people whose homes were ransacked several times here in New York and places around the country, certainly around the world. We had people who were assaulted. Several Chinese sort of thugs would beat up people in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, even had someone shot at. So that has started at the very beginning, and it continues to this day. We still have that kind of thing, getting death threats and things of that nature. Obviously, though, it has evolved a lot and is far more multifaceted and sophisticated. And I think it's harder to track specific movements of who's talking to what and who's pulling which levers of power. But you can see it in some of the outcome. For example, the silence of Falun Gong in some of the major media is no accident. And we can sort of track an arc of when it was covered a great deal, what happened, the money, the amount of money that was flowing from the CCP to our media institutions, and come to a conclusion there. And I think similar arc can be seen in some of the political environment, the economic environment. So there's been a lot of effort aimed at marginalizing and silencing Falun Gong here in the United States and really around the world.
And it's very interesting when you look at the situation, because the persecution itself in China, if we look at the comparison to coverages of the human rights abuses, it's relatively throughout the years pretty smaller than some of the other groups that's been covered. Why is that for Falun Gong if the persecution has been going on since 1999?
It's a great question. And I think it's important to first note that in the beginning, those first 2 years, it wasn't like that. I mean, Ian Johnson won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for his coverage specifically of Falun Gong, tracking people who were being imprisoned and tortured and things like that. The Washington Post had great coverage back in 2000, really showing that that torture is something that they mandated from the top down. But around 2003, the coverage really fell off a cliff. And I think one of the things you can point to is there was a senior Chinese diplomat that defected in Australia many years ago, Shen Yun, and he testified before Congress that in every single diplomatic mission around the world, there's a little department dedicated solely to marginalizing and silencing Falun Gong. And they will use political means, they'll use economic means. So that's the level of focus and energy and resources they've thrown at silencing Falun Gong. And I think when you look at the media coverage, the coverage of human rights groups has been consistent for the last 20 years. Every year they report on this, and then the media coverage has fallen off. And I think you really have to point to that, the amount of focus and resources they've put on, through those diplomatic missions, into our companies, into our leadership, unfortunately.
And if you're just joining us now, the parade is happening where the group will start the parade from near the U.S. Capitol, but they're making their ways down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Freedom Plaza, which will be the destination. And you're seeing some of the banners here that says Falun Dafa is great, as well as behind that, the blue banner actually says the three characteristics of the Falun Gong practice, or the focus, which is truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And Tiffany, I want to turn to you here. The audience members that are listening to us, watching us right now, they might be wondering, how is the Chinese Communist Party allowed to continue to harass some of these people, even around the world, but here in the United States? And what does this mean for the persecution still ongoing inside China at the moment?
So for the first part, kind of as Levi mentioned, the Chinese regime really kind of developed a really wide digital surveillance to follow and track these people. And that expands even if you've left the country. If you're now a US citizen, they'll still harass you. If you have any family members in China, there's even cases with universities where students are writing, say, a thesis on democracy, comparing different countries, and their family is targeted. They're not even anyone of faith, just writing about something negative about the regime. It's gotten to the point where a lot of universities blank out the students' names on their papers. And so that's just like the level that it can reach. And so the Chinese regime is really trying to push this fear abroad. So wherever you are, even if you're not in China, you're going to be afraid to speak up. But inside China, right, that's why it's so important to speak up. Because if you have that outside pressure, then you do see the persecution in China lessening a little. So it's like if you have a big documentary come out or a big film about it, you then sometimes do see those people portrayed in it being released. Like families calling back, they really do find, oh, they have now been released. So it really does make a big difference when it's outside. And I guess the sad thing, right, it's like it's been 23 years and it is still ongoing even to today. And a lot of it is very dark, right, as I'm sure we're going to cover later with.
Yeah, of course. And Dr. Kaur, the question is, how should the United States really respond to this situation?
Well, what's interesting is that the United States is, in a way, responding in the same way that our media is responding, which is a blackout of the information. So the State Department recently released, in the past couple of days, a big human rights report, and I counted Uyghurs were mentioned dozens of times, and Falun Gong wasn't mentioned a single time, which was disappointing. So we really see the same kind of blackout in the U.S. government. What we should be doing, what the U.S. government should be doing, is publicizing the persecution, labeling it, designating it a genocide, which is what we've done for the Uyghurs, and really targeting sanctions not only against individuals and regions as they have for the Uyghurs, but really sanctioning the entire country. I mean, the genocide of the Falun Gong and Uyghurs is being driven from the very top. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party as a whole are driving these genocides, and so China as a whole should be sanctioned economically.
Just to follow up on that, because the difference between maybe the United States versus, say, Russia or another country is the sheer size of the economic ties with China itself, right? So when you're talking about getting rid of some of the economic or business benefits of working with China to, let's say, boost up the human rights for defending human rights, how do you see that relationship playing out?
Well, in 2020, our institutional investors had $2.3 trillion invested in China, which is a massive sum. We annually do over $600 billion worth of trade, imports and exports with China. And so the amount of money that is being made on Wall Street by our biggest, S&P 500, our biggest corporations, is just massive, and they're all hoping to make more and more money in China. But the reality is that China, as soon as someone starts making a lot of money, they're going to figure out a way to siphon that off for the Chinese regime.
It's very interesting. Tiffany, I would just kind of briefly, I think you and I were having a conversation about the ideas of elite capture, right? So maybe the amount of money that goes to supposedly the foreign investment companies that are in China, how does the CCP use money? Let's kind of talk about that, right? To say, hey, don't talk about us, because the NBA is a prime example of capturing that amount of business, right? But there's, certain elites, right? That's why it's called elite capture. Tell us a little bit about that and how this kind of plays into it.
So to begin, as you mentioned, elite capture. So actually, Peter Schweitzer has a book called Red-Handed, and it goes into just the levels of that infiltration. So you have everyone from presidents to Congress people to business execs, Wall Street, education, literally any sector. And what happens is, a lot of people look at China when it was being entered into the world market, and they're like, look, 1.4 billion people. That's a massive market. They're like, if we just get $1 from every one of them, we're going to be rich, right? It's not usually how it ends up. But what happens is, to do business in China, you have to have a part that's controlled by the party, actually. And so what happens is they steal your technology, they take everything, and then they can blackmail you. Be like, well, if you want to stay in your country, you have to give us these things. And so then these businesses or anyone is really indebted to them, basically, and has their hands tied and can't do anything. And so then you see that in the US, you have, say, Hunter Biden's dealings with, Ukraine, but also with China. So that affects potentially, our president. You also have, say, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, right, in the Republican Party. His wife is related to Costco, the China Ocean Shipping Company, and has a lot of deals there. And in China, everything is dual use. So there's a civil use and a military use. So with Costco, they say, oh, no, we're just building, these container ships, right? But they're also building submarines that could then take down the enemy. And so you have these issues where it's like, well, who are you funding? Right. And then going back to the persecution that we're talking about, the reason they can still be persecuting Falun Gong especially, and also Uyghurs now, is the money that's being poured in. That's not benefiting the people in China. It's all being used to, say, blackmail outside companies, outside people. You mentioned the NBA, right? They're like, we want that market. We're gonna not say anything bad. That was about Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. So it's really used as a silencing thing, and it goes back to just the way the CCP operates, right? The Chinese Communist Party, anything they can't control, they want to wipe out. So any way, so either they make you agree with them or they'll buy you out, they'll just apply whatever pressure they can. So it really is just this top-down approach, as several of us have been mentioning, and that's how they're able to keep operating.
And if you're watching on the ground here, there's actually a banner approaching us that says, "Bring Zhang to justice." And Zhang, Levi, quickly just give us a refresher. What is Zhang, or who is Zhang?
Zhang was the leader of the Communist Party when they launched the persecution of Falun Gong, and was the single figure who made sure it happened. It really comes down to him.
Right, and Levi, I just want to ask if do we know any examples as to either that's the 610 office in China or some type of a transnational repression that particularly happened with Falun Gong practitioners, and if there's anything like that, or if there's any case we should know about the U.S. actually doing something that would stop this, like sanctions or anything like that?
Well, I think the sanctions are very interesting.
Okay.
I think because a lot of, essentially what they do is they prevent the person and their immediate family from traveling to China or storing money here. But and that sounds like maybe a relatively small thing, but it's huge inside China because so many leaders are trying to get them and their families out, get them into schools. And so to prevent someone from coming here is huge. And it was interesting when Secretary Blinken announced the sanction against this last official, Hu Wei. He's actually a 610 official.
Oh,
and that's very big because for many years the Chinese regime didn't acknowledge that 610 even existed. And the fact that our government would go ahead and target someone like that was a huge blow to China, but also sent ripple effects throughout China when all the security chiefs and the police chiefs were saying, okay, if this guy could be sanctioned, I better think twice about what I'm doing to Falun Gong in my city.
Very interesting. Before we kind of go on to more us talking, let's kind of take a brief pause and watch a video from some of the politicians who actually send us some of the messages that they want to share with our audience today. We have 3 congressional members, senators and representatives, and delegate actually, who are going to share their message of support, but also message of condemnation for what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Falun Gong in China. So we'll play that for you.
The CCP has engaged in persecution against the religious minorities for decades, including the Falun Gong, Christians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs.
I take this moment not only to speak out against the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, but to remember those who have died for their beliefs. Falun Gong is a peaceful religion that teaches self-improvement through mediation based on slow movements and regimented breathing. Falun Gong practitioners have suffered mercilessly at the hands of the Chinese government for over 2 decades.
Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have been imprisoned and tortured and murdered by the CCP. But perhaps more unsettling than this unrelenting persecution is that China has been able to commit its atrocities with impunity.
America must remain a beacon of principled courage, recognizing and promoting the basic human rights of all people. If we remain silent in the face of these transgressions, we neglect that moral imperative and do so at the peril of civil society.
In China, Falun Gong practitioners can only exercise their religion under the threat of persecution and death. There's a distinct irony about the propaganda being dispersed by the CCP to characterize Falun Gong as an evil religion. Focused on preaching the values of tolerance, compassion, truth, and benevolence, Falun Gong is decidedly not a threat.
The Chinese government's acts of suppression and violence are a reminder for Americans that these rights must not be taken for granted. We must fight to raise awareness of those persecuted in China who cannot raise awareness themselves.
Allowing the Chinese Communist Party to continue this vicious cycle of persecution without consequences is a dereliction of moral duty.
And thank you. If you're just joining us now, we are going to show you exactly where this parade is happening in Washington, D.C. So the start of the parade was near the U.S. Capitol, and they're making their way down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's going to end them as the destination near the Freedom Plaza area. And then that's where which is near the Washington Monument, as well as the White House. And so that's our parade route today. And to expand on what we've been talking about for the first half an hour is setting up really the reasons or I guess what's been happening in China, right? But there are some extensions or perhaps bigger problems that people are focusing on today. One of them is the forced organ harvesting topic that we're going to discuss. And to start with a topic, really, Falun Gong, how did you guys determine, Levi, that forced organ harvesting was happening even in the first place?
First, it started with witnesses. We had people coming out telling these extraordinary stories that was specifically, I remember one instance, the wife of a doctor saying, my husband is taking out vital organs from people in China who are Falun Gong.
Was she a practitioner herself?
She was not a practitioner, and she was lambasted, by the way. This was a very heroic thing for her to do, because no one ever said this on the world stage before. But right away, a couple of brave investigators, particularly David Kilgore, David Mattis, and eventually also Ethan Gutman, they started investigating this, and one of the things they did is they made phone calls into China to hospitals saying, okay, pretending that they needed a vital organ, and they said, trying to get them to say, okay, do you have Falun Gong, where these organs are coming from? And incredibly, these doctors, in some cases hospital administrators, are openly admitting they have Falun Gong people, and that's where the organs are coming from, and they're just waiting there essentially to be killed. If you need a vital organ, come over next week, we'll schedule the transplantation, which is also the execution. And from there, a floodgate of other evidence came out, but that was really the first pieces of evidence that we stumbled upon that really told us the horror of what was happening.
And Tiffany, Levi just mentioned the idea that the murder itself could be the organ harvesting or the transplant surgery, right? I remember this year there was a research paper published by an Israeli doctor named Dr. Jacob Levy, and then along with him was a researcher named Matt Robinson from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, right? And in this research paper, tell us a little bit about what exactly was said with regards to the execution that Levi just talked about.
Right, so the document is called Execution by Organ Procurement, Breaching the Dead Donor Rule in China. So in transplant, you have something called a dead donor rule, where you don't take organs until someone is dead and pronounced dead, right? So taking the organs isn't what caused the death. But what happened is in China, usually it doesn't have a history of organ transplants. And then suddenly, basically overnight, they were beating the US. So the US officially is the number one, about I think 30,000 organ transplants, but then in China you would have like 60 to 100,000. So how do you get all of those overnight? And so China was like, oh no, we're using executed prisoners who are on death row, right? But usually these prisoners are not healthy. But these organs that they're getting are very healthy and they're young. So that caused a lot of concern in the medical stage. So they started looking into this, being like, okay, where are these organs coming from? What's happening? How are they healthy? How are they young? How are they basically being taken on demand? And so this study looked at a bunch of reports in China, in publications there, specifically heart and lung transplants, and they found that usually with that there's a certain process where someone could be brain dead, and then you intubate them and then you take the organ. But what they found in these publications that are in Chinese and was then later translated, Matt Robertson actually knows Chinese, so he could just read them directly. And what happened is there's mention about how the donor died in these publications that they looked at. And so they would cut open the chest, they would look at the heart, it's still beating, and then they would do the surgery. So if they're still, and then they would intubate them afterwards. So that's breaking it. So the study found that these physicians in China and under the CCP were participating in basically executions by organ removal. So they're still alive because that helps lessen the chance of organ failure if you're still alive. And then a lot of the times they just find it a waste of resources and time to give them the proper, say, intubation or anything. And usually with that, it's really hard to get those organs, right? Even if someone did die, say, in a car accident or something, you would have to match them and stuff. But what was happening is people were basically, patients were telling these doctors like, oh, I'm scheduled for a heart transplant. There's unheard of in that field that you would be scheduled for something. He's like, yeah, I'm going to China, and that means that someone is going to be killed for that. Someone's being scheduled to die.
Levi, at this point, it really begs the question, why was Falun Gong practitioners the ones that you guys found were the ones being organ harvested?
It solved two problems at once, or one problem and one major benefit. The first problem was, how do you get rid of all these, what were at one point early 2000, hundreds of thousands, soon became over 1 million and even a couple million Falun Gong practitioners being incarcerated. So how do you deal with that? Gentleman's order was to stamp out this practice. How are we going to, how does that mechanism come about? The second was an enormous business opportunity. I think what people have to remember is this is a $1 billion industry. Right. There's a lot of money in extracting organs and organ transplantation. And so they saw in Falun Gong millions of people that they could kill with impunity who are very healthy and make perfect so-called donors for organ transplantation. And those two reasons really drove this. And it was really driven, at least initially, by the Chinese military.
And we actually have the opportunity to hear from one of the victims of the persecution right now. And her name is Tiffany Zhao, and she shared her story today at the rally earlier during this morning. And she spoke with Melina Weiskopf, who is our DC correspondent, and she was on the ground. So we'll have that video play for you here.
So I'm here with Tiffany Zhao, who is a 25-year-old Falun Dafa practitioner. She's been practicing for many years now. Tiffany just came to the United States just 3 years ago after meeting face-to-face with this brutal persecution in China nearly her whole life. Many of her family members were directly involved in the persecution. Tiffany, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, and thank you for joining us today.
When I was a child, I have started to be afraid of the sound of knocking the door, because several times the policemen came to my home and they wanted to arrest my mom, and they also wanted to know where my grandma was. And every time I hear the sound of knocking the door, I was really afraid that the people outside the door were the police. So every time I have to keep quiet and step on the bench and to check whether the people outside the door were the police. So if I make sure that the people outside weren't the police, I dared to open the door.
Yeah, I could only imagine being such during your childhood, always being afraid of who's knocking on the door. That's just something that really stands out and shocks me. You were telling me that your grandmother had to flee home because of the persecution, and your mother was sent to brainwashing centers. And for those of you who aren't familiar, brainwashing centers is a way that the Chinese Communist Party tries to get Falun Dafa practitioners to renounce their faiths. Tiffany, if you could explain to us a little bit about your family story and what they went through.
Yeah, my grandma was also a practitioner. She had to flee for many years because she didn't want to give up the belief for Falun Dafa, and then her pension from her company also stopped for many years until her dies. It means that she didn't have any source of living until her dies. Yes, it's really evil. And for my mom, in 1999, the persecution started. She went to Beijing for the petition for Speak Out for Dafa. But she didn't come back for a while, and then my father also didn't know where she was. So my father helped me, a 2-year-old girl at that time, to find where my mother was. It's really, really, really evil, and I was, and the whole hardship of my family started from that time. And in 2001, my mother was sent to brainwashing center, and the last time she was persecuted in China was in 2018. Yes, that's my experience. That's my family's experience.
Yeah, I mean, you and your family. I could only imagine, Tiffany, how that picture of your father carrying a 2-year-old child to search for her mom because the Communist Party took her away simply for practicing this meditation discipline. Now, I want to ask you, after going through such a hardship as a child and pretty much your whole life, why is it important for you to continue practicing? Why do you hold on to this practice?
because I have been a practitioner since I was a child, and I think Falun Dafa is really good, and truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance is right. I think as a human being, I should stick to what I think is right. Yes, this is the reason I stick to it.
Thank you so much for your time. And any last words for our audience, maybe sharing your reason about why you want to share this message to our audience today?
Yes, the reason I want to share my story is I'm the third generation in my family to be persecuted in China because we practice Falun Dafa, and I want to use my story to tell more people that how evil the Chinese Communist Party is, and I want to call on more people to join us to stop this very evil persecution. I think the justice will conquer the evil at the end. This is the reason I'm sharing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for ending on those words of hope, Tiffany. We really appreciate it. And the worst part is, it's not just Tiffany who has experienced this. There are many people like her who grew up in this evil environment, and many who are still facing this persecution today. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much.
And thanks again for tuning in. Now we will just take a look on the ground here to see some of the banners as we approach the later half of the parade here. As you can see, this lady here is holding up a Quit the Chinese Communist Party sign, and that's a very interesting one. Perhaps we will talk about in a bit. Dr. Kaur, if you're with us here, let's talk about the business of organ harvesting, but specifically the international side of things, right? Tell us a little bit more.
Well, one of the problems, I think, one of the biggest with organ harvesting, beyond the potentially, I mean, I don't know how many people have died from this, but is that it's compromising citizens around the world. So you've got people from England, Israel, Saudi Arabia, who are going to China to get organs, and they should know that these organs are coming from prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong, potentially Uyghurs now. What they're doing is they're taking blood samples from all of these prisoners, especially prisoners of conscience who don't drink or don't smoke for religious reasons, which gives them healthier organs. And so it's a transnational problem, and we've got very few laws around the world. Britain has passed a law against its citizens going abroad, including to China, to get organ transplants where they would be illegal in Britain. The United States is considering such a law, but we haven't passed it yet. So we really need to insist that our government officials take the proper action against this transplant abuse.
And Dr. Kaur, in your book, Concentration of Power, you actually discuss the ideas, I guess explanations as to the reasons behind why the Chinese Communist Party in particular, this is his book here, would actually go about controlling people. So how exactly does this accumulation of power fit into the concept of controlling religious groups, controlling the Chinese citizens, or now controlling the entire world?
Well, one of the reasons that the Chinese Communist Party, it's so important to pay attention to the Chinese Communist Party no matter where you are, to support Falun Gong no matter where you are, is that the Chinese Communist Party in China, the regime in China, is becoming one of the most powerful organizations in the world. They are incredibly organized. That's what they believe in. They're in lockstep. They try to force their citizens to be in lockstep. There's no dissident. There's no dissidents allowed. There's no, you don't have a free press. So the Chinese citizens are the government is trying to force them into thinking the way in which the Chinese Communist Party thinks. And China is trying to become hegemonic globally. They're trying to control the world, really. This is a well-recognized fact. There's an academic published in Oxford University Press named Roche Doshi, who's written a book called The Long Game, in which he convincingly argues that the Chinese Communist Party is not just trying to control China, they're trying to control the world.
And what we're watching right now is you have this is a legal parade you're allowed to do here in Washington, D.C. And perhaps you've seen these type of parades taking place across the country, in New York, in Los Angeles, around the United States, and other parts of the world, except in China. Levi, the idea of being able to protest or stand on the street and do this is quite, I guess, impossible in China, right? So let's talk about the ideas of technology, right? Because that's the aspect that really helps them to maintain the control. How exactly has that been evolved, or has been evolving since the persecution started for the Chinese Communist Party?
It's interesting because it not only evolved around the persecution, it was built initially for the persecution. Okay. I remember in a trade show, Ethan Gutman was actually at a trade show in the early years, and he's an investigative journalist that's been following the Falun Gong story for more than 20 years, where there were Western companies actually pitching their services and technology as a way to build up what is now known as the Great Firewall.
I see.
And stop people from reaching information about Falun Gong, and as a way to help surveil and track Falun Gong. So Falun Gong very much became sort of a case study, a subject, an impetus to grow some of the technology, which now today is the Great Firewall, which blocks a lot of the internet for Chinese citizens. There's also an enormous system of, I think at this point, 600 million closed circuit cameras around the country called Skynet. Right. And they use that to surveil and monitor Falun Gong. And of course, it doesn't stop at Falun Gong. It's now the entire Chinese populace.
And just as with the persecution goes, now Uyghurs are another group that's being targeted. Tibetans, right? Christians in China as well. Tiffany, what about today? How has the People's Republic of China, or the Chinese Communist Party itself, essentially used technology and censorship to drive it into the ambition around the world, right, to become number one, to surpass the United States? How has that censorship and surveillance aspect contributed to the overall goal here?
Well, to begin briefly, the Chinese regime practices at home first. So as Levi mentioned, on the Falun Gong, they're now expanding out to also the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but also once they've perfected that all around the world. So for instance, they had Huawei, the 5G network that they were deploying around the world, honestly. Even here in America, it's since been banned and blackmailed in the US and certain allied countries, but a lot of countries and even most of Africa hasn't. And even in the case of Africa, you have Huawei partnering with SenseTime, which is a video surveillance platform that's been known to target the Uyghur Muslims especially, right? So that issue is brought up. But what happens in Africa is certain countries there also have dictatorship, authoritarian regimes. And so even if people leave their phones at home, say they're going to protest against it, even if they leave their phones at home, because it's doubled and coupled with this video surveillance, they can track them. And so police know where they're going, and they shut down the protest before it can happen. And even in Brazil now, actually, Brazil just signed a new deal with Huawei to create the first 5G smart city there. And smart city is this term, right, where you use all these different technologies, all these sensors, cameras, the social credit system where you pay with like just a picture of your face, basically, even if you have a lot of makeup. So what that means is you're now under their rule. If they think they don't like you, something you say, suddenly you don't have access to your money, you can't board a plane, you can't do all these things. And so ultimately it goes back to the issue of control, right? The Chinese regime wants to control anything that stands up to it. Kind of the funny thing with Marxist societies, they say there is no God, but they set themselves up as God. And so because of that, anything that threatens their authority, they take it down. And so especially inside China, because Falun Gong was so popular, they're like, Falun Gong is the number one threat that we have to eradicate. And then secondly is the Christians, as you meant, the house Christians, because there's the official Christianity that you can do in China, that you have Xi Jinping on the wall next to Christ. And then there's the house Christians, where they want to read the actual Bible that hasn't been approved and edited by the party. And so ultimately, right, the Chinese regime wants to be the world's hegemon. So through all these ways of controlling their own people, they want to export that around the world and control everyone.
And Dr. Kaur, as we conclude our coverage here today, it's time for some actions, right? And you've been telling us a little bit, but based on what you were telling us, that the Chinese Communist Party's ambition to be the global hegemon, or the number one organization that has so much power, national power behind it, how do we go about solving the issue of stopping the persecution, or that's just letting people know about it?
Well, I think letting people know about it, which is what Epoch Times, NTD TV does every day is incredibly important. And hopefully that will make our governments take stronger action. We need economic sanctions against the Chinese Communist Party, against China in general, until it can free itself from the Chinese Communist Party. That's basically it. We also, unfortunately, China is growing its military at a very fast pace. It's building more naval ships than we build every year. It's putting more tonnage of naval ships, for example. Some of its military capabilities like hypersonic missiles, nuclear weapons. It's growing these things very, very quickly. And unfortunately, we need defenses against that. We need to increase our military spending. We need to increase our supply chain resilience. We can't be in a position in the future where we rely on China for pharmaceuticals, for example, which we currently do, or any of the strategic goods that we really need. We saw during the pandemic that we were incredibly reliant on China for PPE. And we just can't allow ourselves to do that anymore. We need to essentially decouple economically from China, become resilient, become strong, become self-reliant, until we can force the Chinese Communist Party into leaving China or into improving its human rights.
And today's live coverage, really on the screen, you see a wave of yellow, and that's not a color you usually get to see on Washington streets when we're there. But the color really, I think, when I think of it, it brings a hope, right? But before we can get to hope, I think, Tiffany, you have to get steps of solutions to kind of go about how to change, right? So we know that the idea is peaceful protest or peaceful resolution, but if you're in the United States, what are you supposed to do, as say for the audience who say, do we talk to a congressman, or how does that step work?
I think, well, that's definitely a big step, a big part of it, right? So awareness, you have to first be aware there is an issue before you can kind of work on the solutions. And yeah, part of the solutions, right? I mean, if you go look at history after the Holocaust, we said never again. Mm-hmm. But it seems in not just China, but other countries too, a lot is happening again. So how do you stop that? I mean, honestly, yeah, awareness is a big part of it. Because if you look back in the Nuremberg trials, a lot in the Holocaust, they're like, oh, we just did it as we were told. But part of it is if you know something's happening and you don't speak up, you are complicit. And so some have already said we'll see Nuremberg-like trials for what's happening in China, especially with this organ harvesting. And it's not just those involved, the ones directly doing the transplants or, the judges who are sentencing these people. It's also the companies in the West, right, who are funding this, turning a blind eye and really being complicit. So yeah, like you mentioned, word of mouth, spreading it to other people, calling up your representatives. There's plenty of petitions, other books out there. But I mean, a lot of this too, you see it in different areas. So the body exhibit, I'm sure a lot of people remember that, right? And it's like questions of where those bodies come from. China didn't become a transplant nation overnight. But now they are regarded as number one when it comes to transplants. Like medical institutions around the world are learning from them. And what does that mean for our medical institutions going forward if we're learning from them and they're killing these innocent people on demand for their organs? Yeah. So there's a lot of questions there, and it's honestly has to stop somehow, right?
And Levi, as our last 2 minutes here, I kind of, something that interesting you were talking to me about, which is what exactly happens when you neglect the calls of the people who say, we've been through this, and then how do we go from here?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of times you hear people quote Martin Luther King, and justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it sounds somewhat theoretical. It's a nice sentiment. But I think COVID-19 is illustrative in a very, very concrete way related to organ harvesting. This is an idea, I think, the first expressed by one of the lead organ harvesting investigators, David Mattis. If we think about if we got real with forced organ harvesting, what would that really look like? We would have to have transparency into every single medical institution in China and know exactly what's going on. Maybe it's a person there, maybe somehow. If we had someone in the Wuhan hospital on the end of that night, what was December 29th, we would have known, okay, we've got a potentially dangerous virus here, and right away the United States and other countries would be able to take action. And it has a real, not having that transparency has been a real problem. And I think there's a Taiwan is a test case that indicates that theory is true. They had transparency, they saw what was happening, they immediately shut down flights, and it's like they're on a different planet. They were out without the virus for a year and a half, and even today it's a very, very open place. So I think there are real ramifications for ignoring this kind of a bad actor on the world stage.
It's very interesting, as this issue will be ongoing until, I hope that next time we don't have to cover this as the persecution would end in China. But I want to thank you all for contributing and your amazing analysis today. So I want to thank our panelists, but also your us, the audience watching at home, for sticking with us for the hour and really pay attention to this issue. Now, our coverage will conclude now on the 2022 End Persecution Parade in Washington, D.C. I'm David Zhang, and take care. Have a wonderful day.